All right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming out today. There is a growing disconnect between science and the public in America. STEM education is on the decline. According to the OECD, America is ranked 28th in science and 31st in math, behind countries like China, UK, and Slovakia. Scientific funding is being cut. The STEM graduates we do have are having a harder and harder time finding the resources necessary to advance the discoveries of tomorrow. A significant issue with tremendous consequences. A civic scientist, as described by Dr. Neil Lane, a panelist here today, is a scientist or engineer who steps beyond their campuses, laboratories, and institutes and into the public to engage in active dialogue with their fellow citizens. Scientists who contextualize their work instead of obfuscating it. This could be through outreach to the schools, general public, or policymakers. My name is Donnie Zahidov. I'm the president of Rice and Power, an organization looking to bridge the gap between science and the public. And I want to thank you for coming to this civic science presentation this afternoon. Today, we are fortunate to have three distinguished civic scientists with us. Dr. Neil Lane, a fellow of the Baker Institute. He has a long career at Rice, including positions as professor of physics, department chair, provost, and now university professor. In addition, he had a short sabbatical in Washington, D.C. as a scientific advisor to Bill Clinton. And he was also the director of the National Science Foundation. Our second speaker, Dr. John Mendelsohn, is co-director of the new Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan Institute for Personalized Cancer Therapy. Prior to that, he was the president of the University of Texas MD Anderson Center in Houston, the top cancer center in the U.S. and arguably the world. Our third speaker is Dr. Eagleman, a neuroscientist at the Baylor College of Medicine. Dr. Eagleman was a Rice alumnus and writes popular nonfiction books on time perception, synesthesia, and neurolaw. Dr. Lane, Mendelsohn, and Eagleman are here today to lend their expertise in the various specialties to help us better understand the current state of science in America and how it can be improved. However, the concept of civic science is a call to action for not only scientists, but citizens as well. Today, we are all engaging in civic science. The format of today's event has been changed to reflect this principle and will be a little bit more interactive. All of you in front of you should have a sheet of paper with a pen. And the way today will work is we're going to have roughly 20 minutes of moderated question and answers with the panel, followed by roughly 15 minutes of question and answers from the audience. During the first 20 minutes, we ask for you to fill out the sheet, write down one national issue in STEM. This could be STEM education, this could be scientific funding in STEM, or whatever you see fit, and three personal issues, how you as a citizen can possibly help strive to be part of the solution. During the 20 minutes, once you finish filling out the sheet, please pass it to your right at the end of the row, and we'll pick it up. During the 15-minute Q&A in the back, we will organize and group all the national issues and personal issues and actually present on them after the 15 minutes Q&A. And I will present them. We hope this will provide some more discussion about your thoughts, and the panelists can add some of their insight. Once again, thank you everyone for coming today. I'd like to especially thank the sponsors for the Civic Scientist Program, Shell Oil. Today's event is part of the larger Shell Distinguished Speaker Series. In addition today, they will also sponsor a talk on April 23rd by Dr. Anita Jones, former Director of Sciences at the U.S. Department of Defense, Emerita Professor of Computer Science at the University of Virginia, and Rice alumna. I'd also like to thank Dr. Kirsten Matthews and Neil Lane for helping organize and co-host today's event with two student groups, Rice and Power and the Baker Institute Student Forum. Representing the student forum today is Catherine Kai, a Rice student studying political science. Catherine will be moderating the panel discussion. Catherine?
Hello, and thank you all for coming today. So my name is Catherine, and I am a junior here at Rice, and I'm studying political science and policy studies, and I am the vice president of events for the Baker Institute Student Forum. So just to get us started, I'm going to ask some introductory questions to get the panelists speaking, and then I'm going to ask some more specific questions and then open up Q&A for the audience. So our first question is directed towards Dr. Lane. You started the Civic Scientist program. How did this grow out of your own experiences, and how did you envision the concept to expand or grow?
Thank you very much, and thank you, all of you, students, the forum, and Rice and Power, for putting this together. It's a great pleasure to be here. There's a lot of wisdom in the audience, so we're expecting not only great questions but also answers to emerge. And of course, it's a privilege to be on a panel with my distinguished colleagues here today, one of whom understands the body and its problems, and the other one understands the mind. I'm not sure. I guess the mind's part of the body, so
I hope so.
yeah. So we'll at least reflect on it. So I think we'll have a very good discussion. Of course, I didn't invent the idea of the civic scientist. We at least go back to Galileo, I think, who chose to write his convincing arguments that the Copernican model was really the correct one. He wrote it in Italian to reach as many people as he possibly could. He paid a large price for that. I mean, he get burned at the stake, but he was threatened with, I don't know what doctors call discomfort, I guess. So here's a person of great courage. And there are lots of so-called civic scientists all along the way. That phrase came to my attention when a speechwriter wrote it into a talk I was getting ready to give at the National Science Foundation. And I really liked the concept and gave lots of talks, got yelled at a lot by scientists who said, I work 80 hours a week already, Neil. I don't need to be getting out of my lab and off my campus and all these kind of things you want me to do. And of course, I would always thank them for their candor, tell them how important the work they were doing really was, but not everybody has to do everything the same way. But my point was that the community of scientists and engineers, technical professionals, medical people who know more about science than the average person, if the whole community would nudge over a little bit, we could perhaps make some progress in closing this gap. So when I came to Rice, especially after Kirsten Matthews joined us and knows the difference between a cell and a lung, and therefore was able to bring to our policy program some important issues to deal with, stem cells being one that we spent a lot of time on. She suggested that we start up the civic scientist program and bring to campus scientists, engineers, technical people from time to time who would come and share their experiences, people who have not only established themselves in their professions, but also done other things, maybe serve in government or in other ways, get in touch with the American public, and in particular in this sort of dialogue mode. So that's really how it got started here at Rice, and we've been very pleased to have supporters to help us move in this direction. And Anita Jones was mentioned as the next lecturer. She was an example of one among many, many wonderful people. She's a Rice alum who helped me when I was in Washington. I was once asked to talk to a group of women scientists, and that's always a very tricky business. So male is coming in to talk to women scientists and try to say something useful and helpful. And I just made a list of all the women scientists and engineers who had done particular things to make my life better when I was serving in government. Ended up being a very long list, and each of those people made an important contribution in addition to what they were doing already with their day jobs, but helping somebody in another agency they didn't really have to do. It's a great story. Anita is one of those individuals. She'll be here. I hope you all can come and hear her.
Our next question is for Dr. Mendelson. You used to run the top cancer research center in the United States. How did public policy become integrated with your background in research, particularly concerning civic science?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for joining us, and I look forward to the questions and being on a panel with these great colleagues who I know. Take about an hour to answer that question, because I would say half of my time or more was spent interacting on public policy when I was the president of MD Anderson for 15 years, which is the number one ranked not only in research but in clinical care. I'll put that in the country. So the first thing I'm going to turn right around and say in public policy, our goal, of course, is to eliminate deaths from cancer. And 50% of the deaths from cancer could be eliminated without anything that MD Anderson does, and that is through prevention. And it's a travesty that 30% of all cancer deaths are due to the carcinogens in cigarette smoke, and yet we still smoke. We're doing better. When I was in medical school, it was 40% of the country that smoked, and now it's about 20%. And we're doing much better than Asia or Europe. But public policy in terms of smoke-free areas has happened during the past 15 years. You can't go in restaurants in most parts of this country now and smoke. But that took a lot of work, and there was a lot of pushback. And the telling thing for me was when my wife and I visited Ireland and found out that they had no smoking in their pubs. And there was huge uproar about that. And it turns out the number of people going to the pubs went up when they quit smoking in pubs. And that was a very telling thing I learned. But so one public policy area that I was involved in is trying to turn around. The accountability for health isn't with the doctor, it's with the patient with the help of the doctor. And if people quit smoking and exercised and ate better, probably half of cancer deaths would be eliminated. It'd still be a huge problem, but that's a major public policy area. Second area has to do with supporting research. The NIH budget doubled while I was the president of MD Anderson, which was great news. And our research budget actually quadrupled. But the driving force behind that was the doubling of the NIH budget, which typically accounts for about half the research budget of most academic centers. The bad news is that ended about 2002, and it's been flat or decreasing since then. And people tooled up. So imagine if you're running a business and suddenly you can double the amount of activity in your business, and then all of a sudden it has to plateau and come down, and there's people's salaries involved, and there's projects involved, and there's future planning involved, and that was a public policy area that was complicated. And the third one, which was the most complicated, was how to pay for medical care. And yesterday was the day when we hit 7 million people enrolling in the new healthcare system. From what I've read, only 1 million of those were uninsured. The other 6 million were insured. They were just shifting to another policy, which may turn out to be cheaper, which means that the taxpayers are going to have to spend more. This business about I'm not going to spend one more dime of money on this is the biggest phony baloney I've ever seen on television. So MD Anderson has to adapt to that. And we're not unique. Every hospital has to adapt to that. And there are now, the new insurance policies have exclusions, and the most expensive places sometimes aren't on their lists. And MD Anderson is not the most expensive place, but it's not the cheapest place. So this is an area we began to work with while I was president, and now they're working with it in depth. We're seeing patients from all over the United States. How many Blue Crosses do you think there are in the United States? 50. So we're dealing with 50 Blue Crosses. Now, some of them cover more than one state. But the complexity of our healthcare system today accounts for, I'm guessing, at least 20% of the costs of healthcare, why we're so expensive. And we can get into the details. But anyway, the answer to your question is there were many areas in which my job brought me into contact with public policy where we were trying to influence it as part of our mission, which is to learn more about cancer and prevent cancer deaths. And it was a very exciting period of my life.
Thank you for that response. And our last question is for Dr. Eagleman. How and why did you get so involved in public outreach programs, for example, through authoring several books?
Well, as far as why I got involved, I think it's because one thing I was noticing with incoming graduate students was that we teach them lots of details, but they don't have any sort of theoretical scaffolding upon which to hang all those details. So my field is in neuroscience. We generate a lot of grad students. And when they get out, if you ask them something basic like, why do brains sleep and dream? Or what is intelligence? Or what is consciousness? Or any of the real questions that draw most of us into the field in the first place, they've never had an opportunity to sort of explore those bigger questions. And so that I found when I was a graduate student, I got all my sustenance there by reading books by smart scientists who had written for a more general audience. And so I started doing that as well. And I think it's a really important thing to sort of zoom the camera lens out and reach more people that way. So that affects not only the people in the field, but what I started finding outside the field, which surprised me, was there was a huge public appetite for learning about neuroscience. And I'm probably a little bit lucky that way, because if I studied soil mechanics, maybe nobody would care. But when I go around to give neuroscience talks, I'm constantly surprised at the number of people that come, that show up on something like that. I had a book out recently, and as part of the book tour, my publisher had me go to Louisville, Kentucky, and I got off the plane and I thought, I'm so pooped out from this book tour. What am I doing here? But I went to the public library there, and it was sold out with 1,100 people, all of whom wanted to hear about the brain. And it really opened my eyes that moment, because I thought there's some sort of pulse of public interest about these issues. People care, and in the end, these things matter for policy and how we actually run our society. So a specific example of that is I direct something called the Initiative on Neuroscience and Law, which explores what's happening at the intersection of brain science and how we run our legal systems. And essentially the bottom line has to do with this issue that that not all brains are the same. It's generally baked into our public policy that all brains are equal, and that's a very charitable idea, but it's demonstrably false. Along any axis that you measure brains, you find they're really different when it comes to empathy, aggression, impulse control, anything you want to measure. And what that means is that when there's a brain standing in front of the judge's bench and the judge has to decide what to do here, it doesn't make sense to have mandatory sentencing, because this guy might have committed the crime because he has schizophrenia. He's out of touch with reality because of a mental illness. This other guy committed exactly the same crime, but because he's a psychopath, he doesn't care about you or other people. This guy over here has, let's say, a brain tumor that's operable. This guy over here is tweaked out on drugs, and so on and so on. All these very different types of brains were committing the same crime. And what this suggests is we incorporate a more tailored view into our justice system, is the capacity to have tailored rehabilitation, tailored sentencing, and a forward-looking legal system that tries to figure out what's the best thing to do from here forward, instead of trying to solve the blameworthiness problem about, well, was it his fault or his biology's fault? Because that question can never be answered. It doesn't even make sense as a question, because they're the same thing. So this is a way that as we go further in neuroscience, it cashes out in terms of public policy.
So I have one general question for each of the panelists, or for all the panelists to answer, and we can start with Dr. Lane. So in your mind, what is or are the main challenges confronting the advancement of civic science in America?
Well, again, it would take an hour, I guess, and many of you will have your own views, which are at least as well informed as mine on this. I think that there are a few things that enter in. One is that the American public really doesn't know much about science, and that's, we can tell by the polls that are taken, the surveys that are taken, and so, people that believe astrology is sort of scientific, I mean, you can get numbers of the order of 40%. You can get numbers like 60% if you ask people about teaching evolution, or not teaching evolution, or teaching choices. I guess the students should be able to decide what to believe and what not to believe. So if you ask that question, should the student be taught not only evolution, the basis of modern biology, but also other ways of thinking about the origins of humans? It's creationism, essentially. You get 60% of the people saying, yeah, I mean, let the kids know what the choices are and they'll make their own decisions. Well, nonsense. I mean, That's not what education is all about. You don't do that in the science class. If you want young people to understand different views and why people hold different views, of course there's a place for that in our educational system, but it's not in the science class. Science is hard enough already, helping young people understand what the remaining uncertainties are, how scientific research is done, and how scientific consensus is reached, and when that consensus shifts and for what reasons. It's already pretty complicated. So all those things are very important. But to teach non-scientific things in the classroom is not good for young people. In fact, many of us think it's a form of child abuse. It should just be what it is, should be called what it actually is. So we have a public that doesn't really know much about science, and young people who are being taught wrong things about science. And then we have a political system that has resulted in polarization of certain areas of science. So there's a kind of crowding here that different organizations, those who believe climate change is not caused by humans or doesn't exist, or the globe is not warming, and it depends on what question you ask, you find the same organizations are pushing that skepticism that are pushing creationism, and even doubt on whether HIV causes AIDS or not, and perhaps even vaccinations, but I haven't kind of gone that far to check it out. But it's simply political. It's a way to pull together ideas that appeal to a certain fraction of the American public, and then push that out there with the hope that money will come back, or they'll elect certain people who the organization wants to see in business. So that there's a political side, and it's not just on the right. Right now the problems are on the more conservative side, but if you go back in history, you certainly can find the liberals using non-scientific arguments, if they were convenient, to fight against certain corporations, the chemical industry, things that appeared to threaten the environment. So this is not necessarily on the right or the left over time, but right now many of the issues happen to be being pushed by more conservative organizations, I think. So general public lacks knowledge. Many of these issues have become politicized. And then also the scientists are totally clueless, not all scientists, sirs and sirs, about how to reach the public on these kind of issues. I mean, if you've read David books, he's an extraordinary writer. I mean, not surprised people want to learn more about the brain and the mind when they read David's books. And so that kind of communication is really important. And our student organizations who are working with K-12, I mean, the Rice Empower movement, is also extremely important. So yes, the public, but the young public, who really ought to have an opportunity to know more about the world than perhaps their parents do or their grandparents do. So education is a very important part of this. Politics is a very important part of it. But I would say, in the end, the biggest threat is perhaps the failure on our part, on the part of the science community, to recognize how serious the threat really is, and to actually spend time writing, speaking, engaging the public in whatever way they feel most interested in doing. Because if we really don't do that, then I don't see anything down the road that's going to reverse the trends. And given the pace at which change is occurring in science and technology, in other aspects of our country and in the world, this could easily get away from us if it has not already done so. So I think the civic scientist idea is alive and well, and many of you perhaps have seen Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's taken up the challenge by reinventing the Carl Sagan Cosmos series. One example. People are willing to do more, and I just think that we need to encourage that, because if we don't do it, we who understand something about science, if we're not engaged in that way, I'm not quite sure who's going to come and help us out, because I think the issues are so important, and there's nobody else out there really who's going to be willing to take that on. So I think the public understanding and the role of the scientists and engineer and medical professionals to get out there in the ways that my colleagues do and have done throughout their career, is the most important thing we could do, and our failure to do that is the biggest threat.
Do you have anything to add, Dr. Mendelsohn?
Well, you just heard a 5-minute brilliant and wise statement, and I will just say that he's covered what I think the main challenges are, so I'll try to add something to it. That was, I hope you recorded this. That was a really, it was tough, but it took a very high road in saying tough things, and I appreciate that. So let me just add another thought to it. So what is science? It's the investigation and organization of knowledge that helps us to better understand nature. And there's two aspects then. One is getting and organizing the knowledge, and then what you do with it. And I think only half the problem is getting the public up to speed on understanding the knowledge, because I think the bigger problem is what you do with the knowledge. And it's the biggest problem in our society today. It isn't just in science. Our whole approach to government is locked. We can't get anything done. And it isn't just in science and science policy. It's in any policy. So I'll just give you one statistic. When I visited Iran, I found out a third of the people in their majlis, which is their legislature, were professors and scientists and doctors. And I don't think we can say the same in the United States. We're run by a legal system which has become very oriented toward winning your case and winning your point of view. And the other half of what formed America is civility, working for the common good. You read about the pioneers. When somebody new moved in, everybody helped them build a log cabin in 2 days. And that probably still goes on occasionally in this country, but that's not the attitude of our society today. It's different. So that is a background, says that the problem of science policy isn't just getting the information out, it's what to do with it. And people are passionate about what they think about nature. So the data I've read say that about a third of this country believe that every word in the Bible is literally true. And I'm sure there are people in this room that believe that. The majority do not believe that. But if you happen to believe that, that's going to affect your attitude toward a lot of scientific policies. And that's voters. And that's people that form activist positions. We know a lot about birth control. There's huge fights. I'd hate to take a poll in this room about who ought to offer birth control and who ought to have access to it, and what's women's rights versus the kids' rights. And these aren't scientific questions anymore. The public is pretty well informed on this. So what we do with our knowledge and organization of knowledge about nature in order to create scientific policy is something that isn't just for the scientists to solve. It's for everybody to roll up their sleeves and solve. Just like I said in preventing cancer deaths, half the problem is the public taking accountability. So I think we've got a lot of educating to do about what it takes to live in a society and achieve goals, and a little give and take. And if you want perfection, you're never going to get anything done. You're going to have some give and take. And the biggest block to science policy that I run into, the FDA is trying to protect patients from side effects of experimental drugs. If you've got advanced lung cancer, your chance of living more than 4 months are about 0 unless an experimental drug happens to work. And you're much more interested in getting access to that drug than you are worrying about the possible side effects of a new drug, which has been tested in animals but could still cause problems. But because when the FDA makes a good call, there's not much news about it, except, of course, for one very important sleeping pill. But if the FDA makes a bad call and something happens to one person gets injured, there can be a congressional investigation with lights on your face. How could you have approved that? And so they're very risk averse, and our whole society is risk averse. And that comes into this whole area of how do you take scientific knowledge and understanding of nature and convert it to policy. So we got a lot of work to do, but I'll just differ from Neil in saying it isn't. I think half the work we ought to be doing, the scientists, the other half of the work the public's got to be doing, and the people that represent us in the government need to do it. And that today it's mostly lawyers. So maybe we should have teaching sessions, scientists and lawyers working together, because they're good at making laws and we're good at doing science, and maybe we could solve something.
As it turns out, I just started a journal called the Journal of Science and Law, which maybe takes care of this.
Right on.
Yeah, so there's not too much to add to that, except I might throw a curveball in there, which is that there is an impression that scientists sort of have the answers. So if we got together and decided something about climate, we could go out and tell the public what the right answer is. But I think one of the important pieces about civic science is illustrating what science really is like and is about, and a lot of that has to do with the uncertainty that's inherent in science. So just as an example, a few years ago there was an earthquake in Italy, and the group of scientists who were called upon to forecast whether or not it would be followed by a bigger quake, they convened, they made their calculations, they said, we think it is not going to be followed by a bigger quake, and they were wrong. And there was a bigger quake, and a number of people died, and these 6 geophysicists are now in jail in Italy. And they were jailed, I think, because of something of a misunderstanding about what science is and isn't, and what it can and can't be. So, as an example, a friend of mine a few months ago said, look, why don't we just establish a group of scientists that just say what public policy should be? But it's appealing in some way, but of course totally fantastic as an idea, by which I mean a fantasy, because you can hardly get 3 scientists to agree on anything in detail. So in outline, yes, but when it comes to, let's say, climate change, there are a number of models with a lot of variability. It's hard to say what is the right answer about something. So anyway, I'm just throwing that as in a curveball.
That concludes the questions that I have, but at this moment we'd like to ask all the audience participants to finish writing up their answers and pass it over, and we will also be opening it up to Q&A. So we'll take a minute break for that, and feel free and pass it to your right.
Oh my God, look at all the questions. Great.
Can I just add a comment while we're collecting paper? Because David, both John and David's comments led me to think about a book actually written by a University of Colorado scientist, Roger Pielke Jr. The name of the book is The Honest Broker, and the challenge he takes up, not that I agree with everything, but it's an interesting approach, is what should be the scientist's role in communicating either the problems with the use of science or what science itself is, what it's about. And he suggests that the ideal is an honest broker, that you shouldn't really be in the mode of here are the facts, man, go do what you want, and you really shouldn't be an advocate for a particular position where there are uncertainties. You really ought to be a broker to try to broker different ideas, all of them based on the best evidence. But in the end, he concludes no human being can actually do that, and therefore probably the role of the honest broker, which seems appealing, will have to be left to communities, organizations, maybe even entities such as this one. So I guess what we're supposed to be is honest brokers, but it's a great challenge.
Thank you for that comment. So at this moment, we will open up for audience Q&A, and please, after I call on you, please stand up, introduce yourself, and ask your question. Does anyone have a question?
You got a pile of them right there.
Those are supposed to be solutions.
Bring them on. My name is Rachel George, and I'm a student at Rice University. So I was kind of hoping to continue the current conversation. I'm thinking about like programs that introduce science, like the media or Radio Lab, and their tendency to kind of teach the controversy in order to, get people interested. And I'm interested in like, where do you draw the line between making something attractive and, as you were saying, showing how science, is a discussion, and, kind of overblowing things or saying that there's controversy when there isn't, like, when the media presents like the different sides of climate change.
A lot of this in medicine, right?
Yeah, I can start. It isn't just the media. When you're an assistant professor, you want to get promoted.
Yeah.
And if your papers say global warming is going to be only 1 degree in the next 100 years and we should spend the billions of dollars we're doing that on education instead, that might get you promoted to be professor. If you're saying it's going to rise 3 or 4 inches over the next 100 years and we're going to have floods in New York, that also could promote you. So the media is partly at fault because they're trying to sell newspapers and generate interest. But I think the scientific community has gotten into a position where they do a lot of advocacy of their opinions. And as David said, we don't know. Nobody knows whether it's 1 inch or 4 inches. And I think that's the spread that I read about. Maybe Neil knows, because he reads this more carefully. This goes into the business about experiments with new drugs. There are horror stories about people that get new drugs and things happen to them. It's pretty rare, but it happens. So how do you do the balance? So you can't blame the media completely. Now, I'll turn around and say I think the media are wrong half the time. When I read even the august 2 New York newspapers that I try and read, I know that half of what I read is wrong. On the other hand, when I went to medical school at Harvard, the first week, the dean came and said, I want you to realize half of what you learn here is wrong. The data may be right, but it was misinterpreted because they didn't do the right control. They didn't know what to do. So it is you're asking a very complicated question, is what I'm saying. But it's a big problem.
I could also add, and maybe it's heretical, but we have scientists who believe that a large fraction, maybe half, of what's published in the scientific papers is, again, that's consistent with what you said, is actually wrong, and namely the peer review is flawed. Sometimes wrong because it was a tough call anyway, and unless you discover something spectacular, take a chance, leap a little bit beyond the edge, maybe nobody's going to pay attention, or you don't get promoted, or you don't get enough citations, or whatever it is. There may be a little bit too much attention. I'm not sure quite how we would change our system. Ours is a competitive system in science. I mean, we really are cooperating, but at the same time competing with one another for our ideas and our great discoveries and all the rest of it. But there is a tendency often to oversell, and that happens in the literature. Sometimes there's outright science research misconduct. And when we find that, we have to stamp it out hard. I think our community generally does stamp it out hard, but we don't find most of it because unless the community cares enough to reproduce the work, unless it's that important, it just sits out there in the literature and probably nobody notices. So I am worried. Not sure the percentages that I read are correct, but I'm worried that others in our field are concerned about the correctness of the record, essentially, and with the pace simply accelerating, and especially with open source publication. I say especially because it's fast and the peer review process is, shall we say, different. So I think that just...
And alluvial.
Yeah. So I think it makes the risk high. If we don't police ourselves on this, then we're just simply vulnerable, because there are lots of folks out there we've already talked about who would be glad to attack our findings for one reason or another. And if not attack for financial gain or because they're of a particular political persuasion or whatever, the vaccine issue, for example. I mean, parents are confused and they're fearful about their children. And there are lots of examples on that side. Yes, you could call it paranoia, as some people do, but I would just say not really irrational worry about this. So you get one sort of bad story that's highly publicized and dead wrong on the science, and suddenly you get thousands, hundreds of thousands of parents deciding not to vaccinate their children. So I think that we need to make sure that we've got our own house in order here, because any mistake we make will be used against us.
When you asked your question, I just started thinking, so I write a lot of words, and I started thinking about the stuff that I write about, what percentage of it is about, the modern controversy, and what part of it is about stuff that's pretty well established and just completely amazing, like the fact that we've got this 3-pound organ that generates all our hopes and fears and dreams and aspirations and all that. It's made up of hundreds of billions of neurons, and yet we don't even know how to make physical stuff equal mental stuff, and yet that appears to be what's happening, and so on. And in thinking about your question, I think almost everything I write and talk about is actually just the basic stuff on the ground, rather than the controversies that are happening right now, because this is enough. And given what Neil said at the beginning, it's just, most people don't even know this stuff. And there's so much awe and wonder that we can shine the spotlight on right away without even worrying about what's the latest controversy at the fringes, that I think one can get long distance just doing that.
But we can't let you off the hook. Brain isn't as controversial as energy or climate. But let's just say, what do you do with a kid who's very disruptive in school? Should 20% of them be on Ritalin, or is this craziness? And we don't have an answer to that. And that's brain stuff.
Yeah.
So that's something that's big in the newspapers. Long articles about the over-medication of our children. And is this right or is it wrong? Is it better to calm down and do better in class, or is it better to express yourself? Should they have more gym classes? On and on and on and on. These are very tough issues. So even though the newspapers can be blamed for taking a view, maybe that's an important thing, and you should read more than one newspaper.
Yeah, I agree. And of course, when it comes to anything at the intersection of neuroscience and law, that stuff can be very controversial. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm Carter Kittrell, the Smalley Institute at Rice. And one of the things, a new climate report has just come out. And one thing, scientists seem to be almost universally in agreement there's a problem. But when it comes to solutions, it seems to be nothing but cacophony. I mean, you people like Amory Lovins says solar power is the way to go. Jim Hansen is loggerheads with him with personal insults, saying, no, it's all got to be nuclear power. And what you see throughout, no coherent policy. In fact, I just saw Jeffrey Sachs on Charlie Rose being interviewed and said, in 5 years, the Obama administration has come up with no coherent plan or strategy for mitigating the problem. So kind of the question is then, everybody's banging on the fire bell, but nobody knows how to put out the fire. Is there a way that civic scientists can kind of pull all this cacophony together and start developing sensible strategies? Because as Jeffrey Sachs pointed out, one reason the American people doesn't believe in this is because they see no viable solution other than a soak the poor carbon tax. So, let's raise energy prices for everybody, which is going to hit the working poor the hardest by far. So is there a way to pull this together and start, making this more coherent, and then maybe bring the public aboard, after doing that?
Maybe we need an honest broker. I'm not surprised that we're where we are, but it is very discouraging. Climate science is very complicated. It's sort of the whole. So you got to deal with the atmosphere and the surface. None of that is easy or even, and the depths of the ocean. There's still a lot of uncertainty about ocean currents and ocean dynamics, and still room for surprises, I think. So science is already complicated. And then the solutions that have been suggested, many of them at least, are threatening to people if the solution is conservation and turning your lights out and so forth. Part of it, of course, threatening to certain industries if you happen to own a coal company or a company that depends on that. threatening to certain parties because of their donors and their lobbyists and so forth. They're threatening all kinds of people, some of them very powerful, some of them very wealthy. So it's really not surprising that you get pushback. So why doesn't a president put together a rational policy? Don't know the answer to that. I'm not in that job anymore. I do believe that the president's science advisor understands these issues very well and probably has ideas and probably has put them on the table for consideration. But every idea that you have to deal with in the White House, and of course on the Hill, you hope would have solid scientific evidence present as a part of the discussion. But there are lots of other issues that have to be taken into consideration because it's a responsibility of the president or the member of Congress to do that. Some of them are economic, some of them are just political realities. So you have to be thinking about the health of people, not just in 100 years, but right now. You have to be thinking about livelihood and jobs and so forth. And a lot of the decisions that are being made, or the failure to put together rational policies, I think are because those forces weigh into the discussion. It's incredibly frustrating if you're there trying to put together a rational policy. I can tell you, certainly having had some of those experiences. But that's the reality of policymaking in our system, probably every system, but ours is in a way the most difficult. We don't have a king, right, on purpose. We decided not to have a king. And because we don't have a king, we from time to time find ourselves in the current circumstances where people have critical things to say about all three branches of our government, and there are merit to some of those arguments, I guess. Let's hope that we cycle back to a better time. So long way of saying I don't know the answer, why we don't have a rational policy. Certain think tanks do put together policies, as you know. You've looked at some of those, and organizations like McKinsey study some of these problems very hard and try to run the numbers and do a good job. And once you look at what they've done, you realize how incredibly complicated a solution is really going to be. So I don't know the answer to the question, but about climate change, it's a particularly complicated one, and it doesn't help that the scientific error bars are still very large on some of these things, like how much warming in the next century, and especially how much is sea level going to go up because of all the complexities of snow and ice and clouds and so forth. We don't know the answer. We just know it's going to go up and not down. And then it's a matter of judgment as to how seriously you want to take some of the more extreme examples. So if we could get the error bars down, and that's scientists got to do that work, I think maybe it might help us then on the policy side.
I'll just add a brief comment. I share your frustration, but I think the problem, let's take the other big crisis that occurred in this country about 6 years ago when the economy tanked. The economists haven't got a clue of the right thing to do. We had to do something. You don't have to do something today about the energy issue and the global warming. It's something that's going to affect us over the next decades, and most Americans are not focusing on that. But in 2008, when we had to do something, there was no scientific rationale there. You could read Saul Krugman and you could read the conservative Nobel laureates, and they disagreed completely. But they had to make a decision, and they did, and we somehow muddled through it. And I think the problem is the answers that we need to get to your question are not acutely needed in the next year or two, and they keep being pushed away. A little cynical.
So if I could just add something to that, I think what this called one of the jobs of the civic scientist in showing what science is and is not in terms of how the data changes through time is to really encourage nimble social policy instead of us making a decision now that's going to dope the atmosphere and do something to change the climate in a way that's irreversible. We can keep assessing the problem along the way. Somehow in politics, this always gets viewed as flip-flopping or not making a decision, not selling the ranch and sticking with it. But it makes sense to have a really agile policy.
And it might not hurt if we supported the social sciences that are currently under attack. a lot of us who are not close to the social sciences, I can only speak for myself, don't really know in depth what's going on in these fields and the contributions that different fields of social scientists have made. And we just heard about economics. But there have been contributions to our
They
understanding.
think they're quantitative scientists.
Yes, okay. I think, first of all, it'll help us understand the public and how the public makes its decisions if we have a little closer touch with the social sciences. But some of these issues really also have to do with social structures and how, not just how individuals behave, but how communities behave and so forth. I think there are important questions there that are worth probing, and peer review is the way agencies go about deciding with the community what are the most important questions to ask. And so I think a little support for especially when a field of science is being attacked is a good idea. Same thing could be said about evolution. I think the physicists didn't jump up immediately and join arms with the biologists to defend their positions on evolution, at least not as a community, not as a visible community. A little more coming together on behalf of what it is about science that's especially important to society, and what is it about research that is a mechanism that all of us agree is the right way to try to advance scientific knowledge. A little more coming together as a community of science, I think would help us address some of these issues and in particular, some of the attacks.
Okay, we'll take one more question. Yeah.
I'm Dee Ulrich, and I'm an old biology major. And it seems to me that one of the problems is the lack of understanding of science and technology among the public. So when they hear reports one way or another, they don't know how to evaluate. An example is some medical discovery and something's bad for you, and it's based on a sample of 25. How do we better get the public to understand all of this so they can be better consumers of the information they get?
It's a really important point. It's teaching how to think about science rather than just the science facts on the ground. I haven't seen DeGrasse Tyson's new show, but one thing I always admired about Sagan is that he spent quite a bit of time addressing that. So he'd not only talk about the cosmos, but he'd talk about what it means to understand science and what sort of things should and shouldn't be allowed. In fact, he devoted part of one of his shows talking about how any idea should be allowed to hit the table, and then it's subjected to scientific scrutiny and so on. And as a child, when I was watching that was very influential on me. So we need more voices like that talking about not just the latest greatest, but what the practice of science is about.
It raises a question in some of our minds about the value of information technology here, social networking, the internet, the various websites. And I've asked a couple of doctors whether this is helping them in their practice or not. The fact that their patients can go to the web and find out that the prostate is not somewhere near the ear, and it isn't, is it? I mean, yeah, okay. I don't want to get outside my realm here, but the docs tell me that it is helpful to them. That it's helpful that a patient has done some of his or her own research, and not only knows something about the substantive issues about what organs do and where they are and so forth, but something about the controversy also, the fact that there are differences of opinions. So I haven't taken a poll, and I don't know what my colleagues might think about that, but like it or not, this stuff moves very fast now on the internet and in social communities and so forth. And so figuring out how to make the best of that, how to take advantage of that, how to use that most effectively is going to be an important part of addressing some of these communication issues, I think.
Well, I like the question, and I'll address it by asking a question. How many in this group read Dr. Oz in the newspaper? Much less than I thought. Well, he's a great communicator of science. And he takes very specific questions and analyzes them and tells you what's known and what's not known and gives you advice but doesn't say this is going to eliminate. And I think we need a lot more of that. Science isn't very popular in school for a couple of reasons. One is it gets mathematical, and we don't teach mathematics very well. I don't know why kids in Singapore and Korea and China love their math courses, and we don't. But it isn't because of human biology. It's because of the way we do it, I think, because Koreans aren't that different. Their brains can handle mathematics the same way our brain. I have to check with our brain guy. So we have a huge challenge. I mean, let's figure out in the newspaper today, the second biggest section is the sports page. And how many read the sports page? I'll bet you a lot more hands go up. I won't ask. Maybe not in this room. We need a science section in the newspapers. Medicine and science are scattered all over, and they're usually approached from the point of view of who you're going to vote for in the next election rather than the science itself. So you raise a very important issue in the whole area of how to communicate science to our kids and to ourselves in a way that we can make informed judgments. And it's a huge issue. I don't have a quick answer.
But if I could just inject one thing on that, I actually have an announcement that I haven't announced in public at all yet, and I'm sorry that I was a few minutes late today, but the reason I was late is for a civic science reason, which is that today, after 5 years of getting this together and working on it, I just started filming today for a 6-hour series I'm making for PBS called The Brain. And it'll be aired internationally in January of next year. And just like Tyson's doing the Cosmos, this is the inner Cosmos, and the intention is for this to get into not only every household, but also really be incorporated into education at junior high and high school levels as well. And hopefully this will at least have an effect of putting a little bit of pressure on the sports page and getting people open to these other ideas.
Will I be happy when I understand the brain? Yeah, I'd say so, right. Am I going to feel good about my brain?
You'll be more informed. Whether you're more happy, I don't know.
That's the right answer.
It's
so-
great. It really is a great achievement. So
Yeah.
thank you
Thanks
for
very
mentioning
much.
it today.
I'm going to turn it over to Dante.
Thank you for writing out the forms. We went back and kind of grouped them into categories and tried to see what you guys thought of the national issues and some personal solutions. Going over a quick rundown of the 36 people who responded, we had 17 people say that STEM education, getting people in the STEM workforce, was a big national issue. We had 7 people saying climate change and environmental issues were the most important. 3 people saying healthcare. 3 about funding for STEM, 1 about GMOs, 1 about stem cells, 1 person about marijuana, and then 1 person about regarding genomes and the interface between biology and law. And one interesting thing we did notice was that out of all the 36 people responded when we first asked to write personal solutions, every single person here, if not maybe for 1 or 2, wrote solutions other people should be doing. And I think that's something that this panel is about, and I think the panelists really touched on is the idea of civic science, and it's not what other people can be doing, but what you can be doing, and so that's a good thing to reflect on. But kind of going to specifics, I'm just going to read off some solutions people's had. This is for STEM education. Better teacher education salary, I think, is very important. This is a personal thing people put, share personal experience of interest in careers, so kind of going out to students and trying to share your own personal interests, kind of like these civic sciences here are doing. Another cool point was talking about the state of Texas Board of Education and how that dictates the context of our textbooks, and how we need to write letters to editors of newspapers and producers to kind of open dialogue and discussion on this, and use social media to stress the importance of these type of issues. Another thing specifically in STEM, there were several people who wrote on the idea of minority and having the importance of STEM education minority. And they were saying it was important for one-on-one small group mentoring, encouraging role models, scientific role models. One person said it was necessary to get rid of the Common Core, which I think regards to the distribution of classes Make it mandatory for kids to learn the multiplication table before 6th grade. That seems pretty important. Another interesting solution was help educators create and share open teaching materials and textbooks. Manage research software to help students learn more effectively. And let's see. And then that was regards with STEM and workforce. When looking at climate change and environmental energy, most of the people's solutions were regards to consumer behavior and advocate of public awareness. So things like using better light bulbs or hybrid cars, and kind of staying informed about those policies. Regards to funding, it was nothing really personal, but rather just pointing as a problem and not really looking at any specific solutions. And that is a big problem. Another interesting thing was the loss of curiosity-driven research funding. So the idea of really trying to drive curiosity when explaining funding and why it's funding that research. And that was it. That was so that was, out of the 3 people participated, we had most in STEM education workforce and then a variety of other things. And I think that's something the panelists really touched on today. Thank you guys so much for participating in this activity. I think it was very enlightening for me and hopefully for you guys. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion. Once again, thank you to Shell Oil for their sponsorship of the event, and thank you to all the organizers. Can we give the panelists a round of applause? If you can join us now in the door commons right outside for a light reception, I'm sure the panelists would love to stick around and answer some questions.